I want to start with where I start the book, which is the archives. And I open the book in a way that I hope is useful to graduate students as they start to develop their own projects. And that is the question, of course, of why it is that we study what we study. When I went to graduate school, starting in 2012, at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, I knew that I wanted to study my family's history. I wanted to understand why in the world my parents, who are both originally from Jalisco, Mexico, had made the decision to settle in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, of all places. And so my first trip to the archives, Milwaukee County Historical Society, I showed up and I asked them in the summer of 2013 to show me everything that our city's historical society had preserved on the history of my community, on the history of Mexicans and Latinos in the city of Milwaukee. The archivist went into the back room and came back and brought back 3 boxes. 3 boxes was the summary of everything that this historical society had preserved about my community's history. And I was pretty crestfallen, but I opened up the first box and I want to show you the image that the first thing that I actually pull out of box. This is an image of my mom and my dad and me. I'm just a few months old and we're walking out of a church in Milwaukee, Our Lady of Guadalupe Church. This is really the heart of Latino Catholicism in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. It's a place where when I was growing up, I was baptized in. It's the place where my family would meet every Sunday for Mass. It's the place where we celebrated our sacraments. It's a place where people came together. But as I got to looking at this image, I remember that the church had always been something more for my family. It was more than just a place where we celebrated our faith. It was a place that I went to church a lot. And it's not because my family is extremely devout, although, I try to be a good Catholic when I can. It's because my mom would take me on Sundays to organize at churches. There's my mom right there on the screen. My mom was a labor and immigration activist when I was growing up, and she always understood the church as something more than just a place of faith. It was a place to bring people together, specifically around questions of unionization, and to remind people that the Catholic Church, in fact, has a robust precedent, a set of policies, and it's called the Catholic social teaching that reminds us about the dignity of the worker and about the obligation to build spaces together where we can come together to unionize and to fight and petition for our rights as workers. So this image, this initial find, right, this reminded me as I was like a brand new graduate student trying to find my moorings and try to think about what would be the theoretical thread that would help me tell the story of Latino migration to the state of Wisconsin, that the church has been a fundamental space. Whether they were arguing for the dignity of immigrant workers, like my mom was here, building the capacity of social service agencies, or establishing sanctuary spaces for refugees seeking asylum, Wisconsinites, like my family, have turned to these religious spaces and to do, and what theologians Catherine and Justo González refer to as the liberating pulpit, to advance a new vision for what home might look like in the Midwest. So my book, Strangers No Longer, which we're here to discuss today, tries to delve into this history. And as I try to tell, it's a history of profound connections between faith, the ethic of hospitality, and social movements in Latino communities across the 20th century. It's a story about how Latinos of diverse national, ethnic, and class backgrounds have grappled with different forms of hospitality they received in this new Midwestern home, right? So ethnic Mexicans, Puerto Ricans, Central Americans, many of whom faced ostracization in their neighborhoods and in their work sites, turned to their faith and religious institutions that they considered essential in their new communities to navigate things like interethnic and interracial religious fellowship, to wrestle with questions of alienation and belonging, and importantly, to organize social movements to struggle for economic and political rights. So by examining how Wisconsinites welcome Latinos like my mom and our family throughout the century, Strangers No Longer demonstrates that relationships within hospitality interactions are in fact relationships of power. The act of welcoming the stranger, and you borrowing language from the New and the Old Testament, is more than just an invitation for someone to be a guest or even for individuals to become permanent members of a community. As Latinos in Wisconsin learned throughout the 20th century, the extension of hospitality represents the political, social, and economic obligations a community has to those that it views as new arrivals. So across this period, the 20th century, churches, clergy, and laity offered a wide range of welcomes to Latinos, not all forms of which were equal or often given with open arms. And some of these invitations, like those forwarded to labor activists like my mom, demonstrated a church's commitment to its parishioners as full members of their faith and social communities. But other instances, as I detail in the book, could be limiting, coercive, and sometimes even exclusionary. So the book contributes to two different kind of areas, within the broader idea of immigration history. One is a burgeoning field within Latino history that has slowly begun to excavate the role of religion in Latino settlement in this country. Historians of past generations have been reluctant to engage in what the historian David Gutierrez has called the intricate lacuna of religion, for fear that the more abstract and nebulous categories of religiosity and religious practice should be left to other scholars, specifically, scholars of religion. But there's an emerging cohort of historians that are working to better integrate the study of faith and religious communities into labor history. The last decade alone has seen a rise in scholarship on religion and its role in Chicano Latino politics, culture, and community formation. So this book, I hope, is joining this larger project, emphasizing that by relegating religious faith to the status of a cultural artifact, historians are running the risk of ignoring the powerful role that it plays in the foundation of immigrant communities and the connections that Latinos maintain across national boundaries. The second way in which I'm trying to kind of delve into a conversation here is the larger question of where we study Latino community formation. And this is kind of a classic. One of my good friends in Madison, Oscar Mireles, he's the poet laureate of the city. He published a book of poetry. It's called "I Didn't Know There Were Mexicans in Wisconsin." And this is often one of the first questions I get when I talk to people about the settlement of Latinos in the Midwest, is that people don't even realize that there is a sizable community of Latinos who have called this place home for over a century. So by drawing upon migration, labor, and religious history, I'm trying to contribute to a growing body of work within the field that recognizes the long history of Latino settlement in the Midwest. It serves as a necessary corrective to what the anthropologist Suge Vega has referred to as the romantics of the Midwest, right? Histories that depict an idealized white crossroads here in America's heartland, where communities of color are either completely erased or just subsumed within a whitewashed narrative. So to understand Latino Wisconsinites' relationship with belonging in the state, Strangers No Longer examines Latinos, communities, migration, and faith through a central Christian tenet, and that is the idea of hospitality. Recent years have brought an interdisciplinary focus on hospitality, with anthropologists, social scientists, and geographers joining historians, theologians, philosophers, and classic scholars into a subfield that has now been called hospitality studies. And my book, I did my best to kind of posit it not just as a historical study, but really an interdisciplinary study. I'm very fortunate that it's within the University of Illinois Press's Latinos in Chicago in the Midwest series, which is at its heart an interdisciplinary series. This topic of hospitality has taken on a particular resonance in an era of unprecedented global migration. Discussions about hospitality grew most robustly through the work of postmodernist scholar Jacques Derrida, who, in criticizing restriction on immigration proposed in France in the early 1990s, shepherded the development of diverse and widespread debate on the responsibility of nations to engage and welcome towards migrants. As Derrida noted, hospitality is not a straightforward means of welcoming an outsider into your home or in some kind of flaccid idea of engaging differences. Instead, hospitality entails a constant negotiation between conflicting demands, including issues like deciding who is a guest, the length of a visitor's stay, the risks that might be borne between both a host and a guest in engaging in this hospitality relationship. And then I think most importantly, whether a guest can ever become something more than just a temporary sojourner in the space. So, when people think of hospitality, they often think about the idea of table fellowship, right? The way in which you invite someone to the table to break bread with you. And there are certainly instances of that in the book. When we look at the history of migrant farm workers who came to Wisconsin in the 1950s, more than 50,000 Texas Mexican migrant farm workers who arrived in the state to pick agricultural produce all across the state, making Wisconsin the #1 canning state in the entire country. And so that's certainly part of this conversation here, looking at the way in which the table could be a place of fellowship. But table fellowship, thought of in religious terms and in the concept of hospitality, could extend beyond just that welcoming idea of bringing people to break bread. It could also be the way in which we understand the Eucharist as a form of table fellowship, as a form of invitation for hospitality, as a form of welcome, as you see in this image from 1969, when a Catholic church in Milwaukee, Wisconsin was transformed into a place for social movement formation. Father John Maurice here breaking bread with migrant farm workers as they engaged in a great boycott in support of boycotts in Wisconsin and across the United States. So this book places this burgeoning interdisciplinary field of hospitality studies into conversation with Latino history by investigating what I like to refer to as practices of hospitality. Hospitality practices, to borrow from the political philosopher Salah bin Habib, define the boundaries of the civic community. They inform the legal structures and social practices that delimit who has access to citizenship, both in its formal and informal sense. And because hospitality is, as theologian Elizabeth Newman notes, a quote, corporate rather than individual activity, I argue that it's important that we understand these practices of welcome within their larger social, economic, political, and cultural contexts. And so across the 20th century, Wisconsin's faith communities created traditions and practices of reception, some of which stopped at the church door, but many of which extended beyond places of worship and into Latinos' homes and work sites. And I'm just at about 10 minutes, so I just want to quickly just throw some seeds in there for our further conversation to kind of talk about the chronological scope of what this study looks at. We started in the 1920s with the arrival of Mexican industrial workers and how they built religious spaces in places like Milwaukee, developing that original Mexican mission chapel, which eventually becomes the church that opens the story here, right? The place where I was baptized that becomes the home of Latino Catholicism in Milwaukee. We move into the 1940s and 1950s, looking at the development of migrant ministry efforts to try to provide some form of hospitality to migrant farm workers, and the way in which those forms of hospitality were often coercive and based upon the labor and the form of faith that a migrant farm worker could contribute to the state. Moving into the 1950s and 1960s and thinking about Puerto Rican migrants who arrived in Milwaukee, who often found a form of Americanizing form of hospitality, that a form of welcome that was dependent on them learning English, integrating into the Catholic Church and under specific cultural and social values. Looking at into the 1960s and 1970s and the development of social institutions created by faith groups in Wisconsin to institutionalize the concept of hospitality, to make it more than just kind of a benign form of welcome, but something that had resources behind it. The way in which migrant farm workers and social movements in Milwaukee and across the state of Wisconsin demanded a form of self-determinative hospitality where they could set the parameters of welcome within which they'd be allowed into the state. And then finally, the last one, as I'm running here a mile a minute, and the one that I'm hoping that Laura and I can really connect on, is the question of sanctuary and how a form of radical hospitality that people practiced in Wisconsin as Milwaukee became the home to the first Latino, the first Black, and the first Jewish congregations in the country to open them their houses of worship as places of sanctuary for Central American refugees who arrived in the United States in search of safe harbor.